and I'd like to discuss a very timely subject. Unfortunately, someone came to my house a few weeks ago on Shabbos, although he's wearing a mask, but he looked very, very perturbed, very disturbed, and he told me that they were in the middle of laning one of these outdoor minyanim, and Rahman al-Atsan, the Sefer Torah rolled off onto the floor. One side of the Sefer Torah rolled off onto the floor. I guess that's another casualty of this virus. And this is one of those sugyas that I never wanted to talk about, but over the years we did hear shilas, whether it's a Sefer Torah that falls, or it fell in the Aron HaKodesh, or the question of a bacha that dropped his tefillin. Never shilas that do come up, and I guess higia azman that we have to go through this sugya. The embassies have another incentive to talk about this sugya. We once mentioned from the Gedolei Poskim say that when a person learns a certain inyan, he's zoicha going through the inyan. If you learn about Hilchas Pikuach Nefesh, you stay healthy, because either you learn the sugya, or if you don't learn the sugya, there's a kitrik, and you have to have the suffix to go through the sugya. So I think it's pashut a skula that will learn the sugya of this question of a Sefer Torah that fell on the floor, and hopefully that will prevent it from happening in the future. I just want to be ma'isa meidah that we have a lot of shilas about Sefer Torah that falls on the floor, and each one I would really should say chas v'shalom Hashem yirachim, but it will take a lot of time. So let me be ma'isa meidah. The whole share today is one big chas v'shalom Hashem yirachim. So we won't keep on saying that, but the question is, if these things happen, where do we proceed? So I must tell you, this sugya was particularly challenging because there is no mention in the Gemara, Rishonim, or even in Shulchan Aruch about this sugya. In other words, there are some sugyas that you don't find in the Gemara, but the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch discusses. For example, moving a Sefer Torah from place to place is not a Gemara, but the Ramah quotes Rishonim. It's a sugya that also negated in this time of our history, moving a Sefer Torah from place to place. But this sugya, there is absolutely no mention in Gemara, Rishonim, or Shulchan Aruch. This is sugya I refer to as b'mokem shebalei tshuva oimdim, because there are literally hundreds of tshuvas discussing the shaila, which makes it a very full sugya, very gishmaka sugya. The reasons, the nafkamina, but you might notice there's no mention of Gemara or Shulchan Aruch, because it's basically a sugya of tshuva svarim that discuss various questions. One of the first historically discussed this shaila was the Mishpatei Shmuel and Siman Yud Beis. He was a son-in-law of the Binyamin Ze'ev, whose psakim are quoted in Shulchan Aruch, so that he's probably from the earliest Achrayim, and his question actually was regarding tefillin. Is there really a source in halacha that if someone's tefillin falls on the floor, he must fast? That's what he was asked. So he says you should know that tefillin has great kedusha, and you can't be masiach das from the tefillin. But when it does fall down, it's a bezayin. And he mentions the Gemara in Moed Katan Chavav. The Gemara says if someone sees tefillin shenisrfu bizraya, a king took the tefillin and defiantly burnt the tefillin, he has to rise 2 kriyos. Not 1, 2. One for the Gevil, one for the Isis. K'may Sefer Torah shenisraf. So, this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch and Yeridei Shin Mem Lamed Zayin. So, reasons the Mishpatei Shmuel that if you have to fast when tefillin are burnt, it makes sense that the same is true regarding Sefer Torah. And listen how he adds. In other words, we're going to compare tefillin to Sefer Torah. Right? That if Chalila, they burn the Goyim, the Melech burns tefillin, you have to fast twice. Certainly if Sefer Torah is burned. Then he goes from a different angle. It's pashit. He has no right to this, but it's pashit, a Sefer Torah that falls down, you have to fast. Therefore, that's the response to your question. You want to know, vu state is that if your tefillin falls on the floor, you have to fast? It's pashit. Because since Sefer Torah is like that, who adin tefillin? So in other words, the given is a Sefer Torah that falls on the floor, you have to fast. Now, then he adds a ksas raya, because the Gemara says if someone has a dream, and in the dream he dreams that a Sefer Torah was burnt, he has to fast even on Shabbos. So his reasoning is, if you have to fast for a dream, so you have to fast when a Sefer Torah falls on the floor. And then he says this is enough of a smach, of a reference that you have to fast when tefillin falls on the floor. So if you notice, this is really not a conclusive raya in any way. Because the Gemara is talking about tefillin that were burnt. Who said when it fell? And also the raya from a person had a dream is hardly a raya. Because we know we dream, many dreams you have to fast. So if you dream about the Sefer Torah Shanusov, you have to fast. But where do we see conclusively that tefillin that fall, or Sefer Torah that falls, you have to fast? So it seems like it's basically just a remez, but he calls it a ktsas raya. There's a second source, and I think it's a little early in history. The Mari Bruna in the Tshuva Siman Kuf Chav Zayin, he was a Talmud of the Trumas Hadeshin, who was also quoted extensively in Shulchan Aruch. He had the same question. It's ironic. Most of the sources of today are regarding tefillin that fell on the floor. But the Paiskim say, if tefillin you have to fast, kol shkein Sefer Torah, because Sefer Torah is more kedusha than tefillin. But here's the question, they asked the Mari Bruna in Siman Chav Zayin, if someone's tefillin fell onto the floor, does he have to fast? So he writes the following, which is very important as we'll proceed. He says, I saw by my Rebbeim, if your tefillin fell by Shachris, and you didn't yet eat or drink at all, fast that day. In other words, even though it's good to be makabel tainus before, but better is fast by bayayim. So the given is, tefillin fall on the floor, you have to fast. How do I know this? So he says, Sheherolei min hashemayim shetzorech tshuva. If you have this occurrence, this is a message, a wake-up call. And tefillin falling on the floor is undoubtedly a wake-up call. And he has, again, a raya. Again, it's not a raya brewer, but he has a raya that from Vayikoten Chafei, if someone is putting on tefillin and the ritzu is turned over, so it's the outside, inside, inside, outside, and this hapich ritzua, the Gemara says in Vayikoten you have to fast. If you put on the tefillin and the ritzuas were inside out, you have to fast. Okay, don't get nervous. We don't paskin this way. This is not in Shulchan Aruch. Mr. Brewer does bring it in Siman Chafei, but the Rabbi Yonason Steif and the Tshuvas Reish Samaches says not the minig, as many Paiskim say. But the point is, we see the extent of zilzul tefillin. So the Marabruna reasons, if putting on the ritzu is back inside out, you have to fast, because it's a wake-up call. No. The same is true if tefillin fell on the floor. Now, what is a Yiddish response when he receives a message? Tshuva. An integral part of tshuva, or the prelude of tshuva, is a tainus. That we know. When there's tzaras, we fast. So, this is the source of fasting when tefillin fall on the floor. So again, we're going to extrapolate from that. Maduch when tefillin fall until you have to fast. Hu adin Sefer Torah. Again, it's not a conclusive raya, because we don't see specifically fasting when tefillin fall on the floor, but I guess it's understood, Ritzu is who adin tefillin. The third source is the Kapais Tamarim, who was one of the great Achrayim, I guess a little later than Achrayim, this Meram Chaviv, Ben Chaviv. In Sukkah Mem Aleph Amud Beis, the Gemara says you're not supposed to daven when you're holding on to tefillin. You're allowed to wear tefillin when you're daven, but you're not supposed to hold on to it, because they might fall down. Reasons the Kapais Tamarim, and if it falls down, what's the end of the world? Must be, if it falls down, you're going to have to fast. So says the Kapais Tamarim, the Mishpatei Shmuel says you have to fast when tefillin fall down. I think it's also a Gemara in Sukkah Mem Aleph Amud Beis, because the Gemara says you're not allowed to daven holding tefillin, because it might fall down. Obviously, if it does fall down, that's a terrible bizayin. So this is the third source from the Gemara and Sukkah. It's interesting, you need a raya that's a bizayin, isn't it pashit? But the problem with this source is we don't see that you have to fast. We see it's a bizayin, maybe you have to fast. So as we'll see, none of the rayas are conclusive. None of the sources are absolute.
Just one is adding to the other, and you put it all together, you have a pretty good picture. The fourth tshuva, a very Yisaitic tshuva, the Imre Yesh, that's Maram Ash, the Talmud of the Chassam Sofer, in Siman Vav, and this is specifically regarding Sefer Torah. The first of the four, this is regarding Sefer Torah. Someone was called to an aliyah, and somehow he opened up the Sefer Torah, and one half rolled onto the floor. Does he have to fast? Because part of it is still on the bima. So he quotes the Mishpatei Shmuel, and he quotes the Kapis Tamarim. But he has a problem. Listen to the problem. According to both sources from the Mishpatei Shmuel and the Kapis Tamarim, we only see that if I drop the Sefer Torah, I have to fast. Or if I drop tefillin, I have to fast. Where do we see the minig that if the Sefer Torah falls, everybody has to fast? Whoa. Now he's extending the chiyuv. Now he's saying that if Sefer Torah falls, everybody has to fast. That we don't see from any of the previous sources. So he marshals a new source for this chiyuv. And that's the pasuk in Kisavoy, or Ashla Yakum is Divrei HaTorah Hazois. There's a special curse if you don't pick up the Torah. So the Rishalmi in Sait Zayin Dalet has a very interesting reading of this pasuk. Is there a Torah that's fallen? You have to pick it up. So the Rishalmi says, yes, that's the Chazin that's supposed to be picking up the Sefer Torah. Zok the Ramban on that pasuk in Kisavoy, Al Derech Hagoda, he has two pshatim to this Yushalmi. Or Rashal Yokim, what does that mean? So the Ramban says two pshatim, and both of them are halacha l'maisa. First of all, the Gabbai, or the Shamish, that is supposed to put back the Sefer Torah in the Bima, in the Aron HaKodesh, safely, securely. Ashela Yakim, if he puts it in the Aron HaKodesh and doesn't make sure it's secure, he doesn't close it up with a chain of something, it chalila fall down. Or someone that's doing Hagba and doesn't do it properly, and chalila it falls down. So therefore, we see from a Ramban, based on a Yishalmi, which is a pasuk in the Torah, a frightening pasuk I must mention, or Rashal Yakim. Therefore, reasons the Imre Ash, the Imre Yesh, that if someone sees a Sefer Torah falling, he has to fast. Why? Because Li Boy Noikfa, he is concerned, maybe it was my fault. I should have ran over and saved it. I should have been more careful. So it's not only the Shamish or the Magbiya. He's saying that's why the minig is everybody fasts. You were part of that tzibur. Maybe you should have been a little more careful. So we see a source custom made regarding Sefer Torah, not only the person involved, but the entire tzibur as well. There is one obvious problem with this source. We see it's a terrible error if this happens. But where do you see a chiyuv to fast? So that I would imagine if there's an aura looming above your head, you had better respond properly. Now, what should I do? Be nervous? Be worried? No, that doesn't help. Fast. So it's not a raya particularly regarding tinus, but it's a raya that you need a major kapara. There is an important shuva of the Divrei Chaim, the Sanzerav Yedeya, Siman Nun test, and we're beginning our fifth source. He had a shayla where the Shamish was supposed to sleep in the shul to watch the Sefer Torah. There was no safe in those days. And he was no one else in the shul. He didn't want to sleep alone in the shul, so he went and he slept at home. And Nebuch Goyen vandalized the shul and literally destroyed Sefer Torah. They threw them onto the floor, and some of them, I don't think it was ruined, mamish, but it was munach bibizoyin. And the question was asked to the V'chaim, what should be the response of the tzihib, of the kehila, the tzibur? So he quotes the Kapais Tamarim, and he says, we don't see a din tainus. So he says there must be a different source. Now listen to this. He says, the Gemara in Tainus, the Mishnah in Tainus actually, a Seder Tainus, what has to be done? What's the program when there's a Tainus tzibur, when there's a tzar? Tainus, that the Gedolim were made a Tainus. So the Gemara in Tainus, the Aftezayin says you take out the Sefer Torah to the city square, center of the city. Why? To demonstrate Kli tzanua hayalanu v'nis Baze b'avoyneseinu. Oy, Nebuch, we have problems. Maybe it's not raining, whatever the problem is. And it's obviously our fault. Look, we had a beautiful Sefer Torah, and now we have to bring it out to the city square. It's being humiliated. It's being nisvaza. Zok the Divrei Chaim, we see from this Gemara that the avonos, our sins, cause bizayin HaTorah. And if something like this happens, if there's bizayin HaTorah, and he's talking about bringing the Sefer Torah out to the city square, but certainly if the Sefer Torah fell on the floor, that's a bona fide bizayin. So we caused it. Therefore, he says, and listen to this, Am goiza, tainis, on all the people in the city that this story happened to, they have to fast 3 times. Baha, beis, hey, beis. And he says if someone can't fast, he's weak, he has to give tzedakah the amount that he would have spent feeding himself for that day. So we'll soon get back to that the minig originally was to fast 3 times. We'll soon see the minig today. But the Divrei Chaim is giving us a valuable insight. What he feels that the makar of the tainus is, we caused the bizayin of the Sefer Torah, by chet, we have to fast. So kolshkein, when we drop a Sefer Torah, the tzibah has to fast. Now, of course, he doesn't explain, but one person dropped it. But evidently, if it happened in the tzibur, all of the membership of the tzibur has to make a very pronounced response by fasting. Again, this also you could wonder, where do you see tainus? That happened to be, they're making a tainus because of the tzar. But that's the V'chaim feels is the reason. A number of achrayim point to a Mishnah in Brachas Lamed Daled. If a person davens and he makes a mistake, it's not a good siman. But if the shatz makes a mistake during Chazar Shatz, it's a siman ra l'sholcha. Not only is it a bad siman to the shatz, but to all the people that sent him. Because you are our delegate, you are our shliach, and you made a mistake, it's a reflection on us. So the Priyasod in Beis, Ayin Beis, Rab Zalman Sorotzkin and the Chuvas, Mizayim LaMishpat, Siman Hey, and the Divrei Yor, the Sat Mirav, and Siman Zayin all say, this is a source to fast when the Sefer Torah falls. Because whether it's the Shamish or the Gabbai, generally it's the Shliach Tzibah that caused the Nefil of the Sefer Torah. So that's a bad siman, a bad omen for the rest of us. Therefore, we all have to fast. Now, of course, this really is not a perfect raya, because true, it's a siman ra, but where does he have to fast? But one thing I will say, Rab Zalman Sorotzkin points out beautifully, that based on this reason we understand the Minig Yisrael. When a Sefer Torah falls, everybody fasts. When a person drops his tefillin, only he fasts. What's the chilik? He says beautifully, if a person drops his tefillin, that's his private problem. So it's like a person made a mistake during davening. So it's a bad siman for him, he has to fast. But if the Sefer Torah falls, generally that's a siman for the shalchav, for the tzibur, and all the tzibur has to fast. And I saw what's actually the 7th remez, and this is just the remez, the Chuvas Torah, you could see Archaim Siman Memtes. He says it's we know historically that when Moshe broke the luchais was Shivasa B'Tammuz. So apparently, when luchais are broken, it's a time for fasting. So he assumes that Sefer Torah that falls also has that type of feeling that it's like the Sefer Torah that broke, and therefore we have to fast. Now the emphasis, we have to realize that all of the sources, none of them are really conclusive. As we mentioned, we could always ask on the reason, especially the last reason, who said that you compare Sefer Torah to broken luchais. It seems that it's just all the reasons are really true. One is really adding and supplementing the other. If you put together all these reasons, the 6 or 7 reasons that we had, it's enough to understand the Minig Yisrael. I always feel that the real reason is, to quote the Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish was once visited by Ben Gurion, who wanted to promote Giyus Bonais, drafting the girls into the army. And he asked the Chazon Ish, tell me, where does it say, where does it say that you're not allowed to do that? So Chazon Ish opened his jacket and he pointed to his heart and said, "Auf mein Herz steht es. Auf mein Herz steht es." So I think with the answer, really the source why we fast when I say if Torah falls, auf mein Yiddische Herz steht es. Yes, we had the Mishpatei Shmuel, is like a dream that a Sefer Torah was burnt. We had the Rebrunya, like it's a wake-up call. We saw the copies tomorrow, the Beis Limor Sukkah. Maram Ash is Yushalmi, and the Ramban. The Chaim is a Sefer Torah in Nizbaza. We saw the sixth reason based on the Brachis Lamed Beis, a bad siman for the Shalchav, and the analogy to Shviras Haluchais. But at the end of the day, of the Yiddish Har status, and that is undoubtedly the Minig Olam. And now let us apply this Lamaisa. So let's not forget, since it's a school to learn the Sugya, we'll try to talk about as many shalos as we can to get the most protection, the most school from our learning. So one thing is Pashut, if the Sefer Torah falls, even if the mantle is on, the mashal during the Psicha, it falls on the floor, so the actual cloth doesn't touch the Sefer Torah, doesn't touch the floor, it's still a chiyuv to fast. Who says it's not me? The Magen Avram, in the beginning of Siman Mem Dalid, quotes our Mishpatei Shmuel, and he makes an important distinction. The Mishpatei Shmuel says you have to fast when tefillin fall on the floor. That's only if the tefillin, actually the bottom, hit the ground. If the tefillin is in the box, or certainly in the mantle, you don't have to fast. But Sefer Torah that falls, even ben atikon, you would have to fast. So Agav, we see that a Sefer Torah that falls, even in the mantle, you have to fast. But you also see there is a difference between Sefer Torah that fell and tefillin. Both we fast, but the difference, as we said, the Sefer Torah is even in the nartik, even in the mantle, but tefillin is only if the actual tefillin hits the ground. Now, the emphasis, there's a whole different sugi we'll leave for a different shir. Tefillin that falls on the floor, mezuzah, and megillos, and klafim, and many other shilas, but today we're focused on Sefer Torah, even if it's on the mantle. The next question is a challenging question. Let's say it was a real oinus. The Sefer Torah fell, it was mamish unpreventable. Now, of course, when you're holding Sefer Torah, you have to be very, very careful. I'm talking about it was a qualified oinus gomer. Is there still a chiyuv to fast by an oinus gomer? So the Lamdan will say, well, we know that even regarding the worst aveira of znus, l'nairo l'sasadava, oinus achmana patre. So the kolshkein our sugya that, as we showed, is not a gemara, is not a in Shulchan Aruch, it's a minig. So isn't there a Torah l'nairo l'sasadava? But here we'll say, like we'll say to all the questions, zil basatayim. The reason, a lot of the reasons apply even if it's not your fault. The wake-up call, the seeing the bezoyin of Torah, it's not that chalila you are mavaz of the Torah. But to see a Sefer Torah on the floor as a ma'aseh is a scene of bezoyin. It's a horrific scene. So if the avla would be the action the person did, so you say oinus is patur. But that's not the case. It's the bezoyin of the Sefer Torah, it's the wake-up call, like the Divrei Chaim, it's to see a Sefer Torah bezoyin. And I think most convincing, one of the original sources from the Gemara in Moed Katan Chavav, Sefer Torah that was burnt bizraya by a wicked king, of course, as an oinus, you couldn't prevent it. So the emes is the tshuva is Harei Bashemayim. I don't have that, but I saw the Kasta de Anya in Chele Gimel Omed Kuf Lamav quotes this tshuva. He quotes a few Gemaras, not regarding Sefer Torah that fell on the floor, but regarding bezoyin Sefer Torah, even if you didn't cause it, but a Sefer Torah that's bezoyin is the problem. So we'll say that seems to be the minig. Moshe says it in Chele Gimel, Siman Gimel, clearly that even if it's oinus, that doesn't change the bezoyin. There are some that are mekel by oinus, but I must say the minig Yisrael seems to be even oinus. It's the wake-up call, it's the message, it's the bezoyin of the Sefer Torah. Next question is a little more challenging than it seems. When the Sefer Torah does fall, who has to fast? I'll give you three possibilities. The person involved, when I was doing the psicha and dropped it, the hagba person, that's involved. The second level is the people in the shul that were there, that were davening with the minyan. And the third is people that were not there, but they're part of this kehillah. They have a membership. They might be vacationing in Florida, but they are a member of this kehillah. It's during the winter, they're not there. Or he's davening a different shul. So the emes is, the original source from Mitzuash and his hapcha, only the person himself fasts. Tefillin that falls on the floor, only the person fasts. And that leads the Chidah and Shiurei Bracha, Reish Pei Beis, Sitka and Dalit, and more barichas in his Tshuva Sefer Chaim Shol Siman Yud Beis. He writes the following. makes a very aggressive statement. I heard about a certain kehila, the Sefer Torah fell, and the Rav was great at tiniest on the whole tzibur, Beis Hey Beis. I don't understand. The one that dropped it has to fast Beis Hey Beis. But why is the tzibur guilty? What did they do? So the Chidah seems to have the opinion it's only the person that was involved with the nefila. Again, involved, whether it's hagba, psicha, or whatever, who's missing it and it rolled off, whatever the case is, but the person involved and no more. However, Poik Chazi, the minig is the tziba fasts. Why? We know the answer. It's zil basa taima. Whether the reason is we witnessing a bazayin like the Divrei Chaim, or the wake-up call, or based on the Rishalmi, and you see a scene like this, you got to be careful. But then again, based on the Rishalmi, you could say, or the person, maybe the tziba is not guilty, but Ram Aish did say the other people feel guilty, they should have prevented it. Definitely, the Divrei Chaim's whole svara, what prompted him to say a new svara was to explain why the whole tziba has to fast. And definitely the reason of brachas lamed beis, that it's a simin ra l'sholchav, that applies even for all people. And again, that's the minig, maybe a state of Yiddish Haaretz like that, but the minig is the entire tziba has to fast. But I must mention, let's not forget, the starting point is there is no chiyuv b'din ha-Gemara or Shulchan Aruch to fast. The whole chiyuv, quote unquote, is a minig. So that's why the Divrei Chaim himself says, even though he was goyz at times on the entire tzibur, but if a person is not well, he's not healthy, he could give tzedakah instead. Because the starting point is interesting. There's no real chiyuv, but it's a very strong minig. So there has to be leeway for people that can't do it. So the minig kadam is that the tziba fast, but if someone finds it hard, there is what to be made. Now, I once had a shayla, there's a minyan, there's a shul that has a few concurrent minhagim. They have in this room and that room and upstairs, and it fell in one tzibur, in one minyan. Do the other two minyanim have to fast also? So you could be a little creative, when people spot a streimel of a chassan during Sheva Brachas, even in one minyan, the whole place doesn't say Tachlin. Or when there's a bris in the building in one minyan, they skip Tachlin and all minyanim. I'm not saying that's l'chol adayis, but if regarding Tachlin you're quick to say it's one shul, it might make sense because it is one shul. So even though you davened in a different minyan, you weren't there b'shas ma'isa, but you're in the same Beis HaKnesses, and it's probable that the entire oil that was in that building, that Beis Medrash, has to fast. Even though you're not part of that minyan, you don't actually see it, but it's not like a member who's in a different location, you're in the same location. If someone wants to be makel, I can understand it also, because maybe it's only those that saw it. Next question, is it true every member has to fast? So this is really zil basa taima. If it's a message, so it's a message for the kehila. According to Divrei Chaim, he says, Beferish, it's a kehila. And I saw the Shraga HaMeir, Chele Gimel, Siman Aleph at the end, the Tzitz Eliezer, and has a beautiful tshuva, Chele Kei, Siman Aleph, Perik Hey, brings many shitas that anybody in that belongs to that kehila. In other words, the membership has to accept the same tainus. So it's really 4 levels. People involved, the people that saw it, that minyan, in a different minyan, concurrent minyan, and now we have membership, they're all included. But as you could realize, there are some that are makel, because the whole chiyuv is not a chiyuv midin ha-Gemara, and they would say, if you're not there in the shul, you don't have to fast. But lipata b'loi klum, efsha. Your kehila suffered this terrible tragedy. And I saw the Vayan Yosef, the Puparov, in Simon Chavtes and Simon Lamed. He writes that he once was together with the Satmarov when a Sefer Torah fell on the floor, and they decided to break the kehila into 3 different parts. The person that was involved with the nefila has to fast 3 taniyos. The tziba that was there, b'shas ma'isa, has to fast once. And the membership, those that are part of the kehila but not there, b'shas ma'isa, have to give pidyon, give tzedakah instead of fasting. Rav Sternbach and the Tshuvas Hein and Zayin also says there's a chiyuv on the membership to at least give tzedakah to be paid the tainus. Who's potter from this tainus? Who was there b'shas ma'isa? Is anybody exempt from the fast? So logic dictates that a chayla or an ish zaken that pashat will find it very draining to fast could rely on giving tzedakah. Don't forget, the Chidah and others hold only the person that dropped the Sefer Torah. We are machmir the entire tzibah that was there. But if someone's a zaken or chaylam and perhaps on a regular taina tzibah he doesn't fast, so how could you mechayim him to fast this more than a regular taina tzibah? But again, even this person who is not required to fast, but lipata b'lo klum I efshar, he should partake in the Yom Tefillah, if they make a Yom Tefillah, if they have a drasha, or he should definitely give tzedakah, but l'maisa chiyav tainis, we won't say. Interesting question that I found surprising. Do women have to fast? Let's say it happened Shabbos morning, there's this nation was full of women, do they have to fast? So I saw a much more tragic shaila, and this is in the Divrei Chayim and the Hashmatos, Chelik Beis, Siman Aleph, in the new print, it's the beginning of Chelik Gimel. The following really tragic shaila. The shul was left with candles burning, and the shamash who was supposed to watch it didn't stay in shul, and it caught fire, and 4 Sefer Torah burnt. And they wrote to asked the B'chaim what should be their response. So he says a very vigorous tshuva, but he adds, Hanashim lo yisanu. Everybody has to fast, but not the women. He doesn't even say why. Maybe because women are more shvach, by chassidim taka, women don't fast, or by regular taniyos. Maybe that's the cheshbon, but I also saw the Vayan Yosef also says that women don't fast. So we could say Neman Aleinu Divrei Chayim, that even if men fast, women are potter. Ketanim, who really don't fast even Yom Kippur until their bar mitzvah, so if they're potter from real taniyos, they're certainly potter from this. But if it ever happens, it's a very important chinuch to give a child that if you were part of this tragedy, you have to take part of its response. You're not allowed to fast, but you should do something, come to the Isairis Tshuva, learn something, maybe give tzedakah, but it's a very good opportunity to mechanech a child in this most important endeavor. How many times do you have to fast? The person that came to my house said he heard you have to fast 40 days. No, I did see him occur to fast 40 days. Actually, the Orchos Chaim and Siman Mem and the Divrei Yatza, the Kloisenberg and Yeridei Kuf Pei Daled quote from a Ramaz that there's a source to fast 81 times, which is not Dominic, don't get nervous. Lamaisa, as we saw, the Chidah that I mentioned in our Shalom and Tov Kuf Samach Vav, Marmash, Divrei Chaim, the Beis Yitzchak will soon see in Kuf Samach Hey, and the Avnei Tzedek, in Kuf Zayin, all record a minig that fast 3 times. Bahab, Monday, Thursday, and Monday. However, it seems to me the minig is that because we're shvach today, we don't fast 3 times. 1 tainus is sufficient. Now, Lamaisa, the one that was, if a person was negligent, there would be a good reason he should fast 3 times. But certainly for the tzibur at large that do fast, 1 time is enough. Ma'isa Shahaya, the Avnei Nezah in Yeridei Shinai and Ches has a shaila that Tisha B'Av night Goyim broke into a shul, vandalized the shul and the Sefer Torah. They threw it in muddy water and it was ruined. So he says that, of course, this is much worse than Sefer Torah Shenafal. And he says that Lamaisa, he quotes some of our sources, he quotes the Chidah, and then he has his own reason. When something happens, it's a wake-up call. But after all this, he says that since no one was at fault, if it was an oynis, you're potter. So apparently, the Avineza goes with the shita, oynis is potter. But as we said, this is unacceptable because the place can say even oynis is chayiv. So in that case, even though no one did it, in other words, a guy did it, so it's not pshat a yid did it, but oynis, no one did it. But the mere fact that the Torah suffered such a terrible bezoyin, avada, a appropriate response should be made. Ma'isa Shahaya, the Sefer Torah fell on the floor on Shabbos during Psicha. So you're wondering, what's the Shaila? So listen to a Chiddush of the Beis Yitzchak, the Levav Rav, and Yeridei Kuf Samachei. He has a Shaila during Galila. Part of the Sefer Torah fell on the floor, which we'll soon see even partially on the floor, it requires a tainus. So what's the Shaila? But then he adds from his Eidim a murdik chiddush. If the Sefer Torah fell on the floor on Shabbos, there's no Chiyuv Tainus. The same thing that happened during the week, there's a Chiyuv Tainus. But Shabbos is exempt. Why? So listen to an Einfall. Because the Birkei Yosef in Yeridei Siman Shin Mem says, if a person sees a Sefer Torah burning on Shabbos, Sefer Torah Nisrav on Shabbos, he doesn't rise Kriya. Even though halacha is, if you see a Sefer Torah Nisrav, you have to rise Kriya, but on Shabbos you can't rise Kriya, and once you have to rise Kriya on Shabbos, you don't do it on Sunday, or Matzoi Shabbos. So reasons the Edom of the Beis Yitzchak, since the reason to fast when a Sefer Torah falls on the floor is like a Sefer Torah Shenisraf. No, Sefer Torah Shenisraf, we don't fast on Shabbos, we don't rise Kriya on Shabbos. So it stands to reason, there's no response when a Sefer Torah falls on the floor on Shabbos, and therefore you don't have to fast. So that's another Zilbasa timer. Since the reason Sefer Torah falls on the floor is like Sefer Torah Nisrav, Shabbos is exempt. Now, needless to say, according to this, it's not only Shabbos exempt. Shabbos or Yom Tiv, Yom Kippur, whenever you can't rise Kriya, there's no Chiyuv of fasting. However, for us this is very hard to accept because that's only one of 7 reasons. The bulk of the reasons is no different Shabbos or weekday. Plus, many of the shilas, you'll see, we're talking about Shabbos, some are talking about Yom Kippur, Yom Tiv, Simchas Torah. There are a number of tshuvas when if there falls on Simchas Torah, it's Yom Tiv, you can't rise Kriya. And the emes is the Raya from Kriya is not a Raya. Because Kriya is totally on the Chimam Halev when you see a tragedy. Once it's Sunday or Matzoi Shabbos, it dissipates. But here we're talking about you need a kapara or a wake-up call. Or it's a bad simon. 6 of the 7 reasons are not dependent on Sefer Torah Shenisraf. And again, as I told you, there are rayas from the Poskim that talk about Shabbos or Yom Tov, and no one thought of saying Shabbos is different. And even the Beis Yitzchak is not so convinced that this psak is right, so we could say emphatically that even if it happened on Shabbos, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur, Simchas Torah, the same halacha applies. Question. A person fell down with the Sefer Torah, but the good news is he clutched to the Sefer Torah carefully, so he's sitting on the floor. But the Sefer Torah did not touch the floor at all. This can happen on Simchas Torah when a person's dancing, he lost his balance. So here's the scenario. He fell down with the Sefer Torah, but he's sitting on the floor, and at no time did the Sefer Torah touch the floor even partially. Does he have to fast? So the Lamda will say, well, the Sefer Torah fell, but then again, it didn't hit the ground. So here I saw the Har Tzvi and Siman Mem has this shaila regarding Simchas Torah, and he says that the Sefer Torah didn't fall, the person fell. So he says there's no Chiyuv Tainus. Okay, a person should give tzedakah, he says, but if the Sefer Torah did not hit the ground actually, there's no Chiyuv Tainus. What's a little of a more of a challenging question, when Lamaisa, if the Sefer Torah hit the ground even partially with the Atzei Chayim. So now he fell and the Sefer Torah hit the ground. It didn't fall flat on the ground, but a part of it touched the ground. So you'll say, well, the cloth didn't touch the ground, so what's the problem? But that's wrong. Because we began with the Magen Avram, the Sefer Torah that falls even ben Atikoi, even its mantle, you have to fast. And we'll soon see that even falling partially is chayiv. So that's taka problem. If the person clutched Sefer Torah and it didn't touch the ground at all, he's pata. If it hit the ground partially, then the tzibah has to fast. A interesting question, it's very good to talk about it when you have a chance by the Shabbos table. Let's say the worst happened. A person tripped, he fell, and now you see a most horrific scene. A yid's laying on the floor, and next to him a Sefer Torah is laying on the floor. Who do you pick up first? The person or the Sefer Torah? Don't forget the famous pasuk in Parashat Ki Tzeitze, when a person's Chayiv Misa is being hung, because the mitzvah of Tliya, you have to take it now right away. Because Kilas Aleikim Tali. Even a Rasha is a shtik Aleikus, is a Tzelem Aleikim. The Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, Gepaskin Yeredeya, if someone is standing b'Shas Yitzias Hashem Avayid, he has to rise Kriya K'Sefer Torah Shenisraf. So a Yid is a Lebedik K'Sefer Torah, a Yid is a shtik Tzelem Aleikim. But I saw the Tzitz Eliezer and Yud Zayin Lamates discusses this question, And he really points out that this is totally in the Stiras HaSugis. Listen to this. Kedusha Lamed Gimel says you have to stand up for a Sefer Torah, for a Talmid Chacham, certainly if you stand up for a Sefer Torah. So Sefer Torah is more. But then the Gemara says in Makis Chav Beis, how foolish the people are, they stand up for the Sefer Torah and not for the learners. So it seems that the Talmid Chacham is more. So it's a big sugya, I'll leave that to you to decide. But the beauty is every part of our Torah has a reason to it. The question is a person before a Sefer Torah is totally how we identify the person, how much of a Sefer Torah he really is. I should say most places the Sefer Torah is picked up first because a person laying on the floor is a semi-bezayin. But a Sefer Torah on the floor is a horrible bezayin, and that has to be stopped first. A Sefer Torah question. It didn't fall on the floor mamish. It was during Simchas Torah. I saw one child during Purim. But whatever the case is, there was very lively dancing. The whole Aron Kodesh toppled onto the floor. So the Sefer Torah in the Aron hit the ground, but didn't touch the ground. The Aron did not the Sefer Torah. So this is worse, in a certain sense, than the previous case when the person fell down. Here the Aron Kodesh, that's Tasmisha Kedusha, also hit the ground. But the Paiskim say that the Sefer Torah did not touch the ground. It's protected by the Aron, and there would be no Chi of Tainus. Of course, a response should be made, but more than that, you don't need. Question. The Sefer Torah fell down entirely, but it fell in the Aron HaKodesh. Now, today, the Aron HaKodesh are a little thinner, but they used to have wider Aron HaKodesh. Sefer Torah fell flat, laying flat on the floor of the Aron HaKodesh. Do you have to fast? So this is tricky. It didn't hit the ground, but unlike the previous case, it fell down flat. So we could say that it didn't hit the ground. But then again, it fell. So the question is that perceived as a bezoyin if it's on the floor of the Aron HaKodesh? We might like to say the Aron HaKodesh floor is part of Tashmisha Kedusha. So here I saw the Avnei Yoshvei Chelik Dalet Siman Kuf Tes quotes Abba Yashiv that says that Lamaisa, the floor of the Aron HaKodesh is not a Mokam Hiluch B'nei Adam, and therefore it's not a bezoyin, and you don't have to fast. Sefer Torah fell on the floor, correct, but not the floor that's walked on. It's the Aron HaKodesh floor, and there's no Chi of Tainus. Some compare this to a different shaila, which when it fell on the steps, you have to fast, but that's the steps, but not in the floor of the Aron HaKodesh. What happens, Nebuch, too often, a person opens the Aron HaKodesh and the Sefer Torah comes tumbling out and hits the ground. So that Pashat of Ad the Chi of Tainus. Even though it's an Einus, we said earlier, Einus is Chayiv. And Taka, the Kinyan Torah, Chelik Zayin, Siman Ayin Vov, like a Kremach HaChodesh, Kuf Lamed Hei Te Zayin, say, even though it wasn't the person's fault, first of all, he should have been more careful, but besides that, there's no chiluk. He has to fast. The Alicha Shloim, Rav Shlomo Zalman, and Pesach, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, is a big chiddush, Leizachis Yilhavin. He says it's an Emais in a fila, but no one was mapelit. No one caused it to fall. There's no Chi of Tainus. And that's what he says, but we can't Leizachis Yilhavin, because Lamaisa, from the Gemara, we saw regarding, his raya is actually that a Sefer Torah that was burnt, you have to fast because someone did it. Is mashma, if no one did it, you don't have to fast. That's his raya. But the raya al-Kharifah is fakert, because the Gemara speaks about when the Bas Ya'ano, an ostrich, ate it, there might have been a chiv also. So the Paiskim definitely seem to say, I saw the Kinyan Torah has a nice tshuva, as I mentioned. So even if no person dropped it, but even we saw earlier, Lamaisa, that it's the message, it's the wake-up call, and therefore a tainus should be made. Question, it fell on the steps or the platform going up to the Aron. Now let me just be clear. We would we should go back and stall, and there is no question like this because it's the whole shul is flat, but in many shuls there's a platform, there's steps going up to a platform, and there you go to the Aron HaKodesh. So it's not ground level, so to speak. The shul's on one level, you go up a few steps, there's a platform. The question is if the Sefer Torah fell on either the platform or the steps going up to the platform. So Lamaisa, it's not as bad as the floor, but it's still a place that people walk. And the raya I could bring is, your Deya Reish Pei Bei Siv Zayin, you're not allowed to put Sifrei Kodesh, Kolshkin and Sefer Torah, onto that platform, onto the madregas, onto the steps, or the platform leading up to the Aron HaKodesh. So if you can't put Svarim down, even not a Sefer Torah, even Sifrei Kodesh, so obviously it's considered a flaw. And therefore the Pri Hasoda in Chelik Beis, Ayin Beis, the Mechas Alaz in Gimel Nun Beis, the Marshag that you cited to Kechuva in your Yeredeya Nun Gimel speak about it fell on the steps going up, and that's the Rav Sternbach on that Shuv that I mentioned earlier. The Tzitzel Yezeh Chelik Hey Amud Chaf Aleph all say even if it fell on the steps, but people walked there. Now the platform is a little easier to hear. Maybe it's potter, because a platform no one walks generally, except the Rav when he goes to speak. But at the end of the day, it's the ground. It's not like a bench. For example, someone's sitting on the bench, and he drops the Sefer Torah onto the bench. So that there's no chiyuv tainis, didn't hit the ground. But the platform is not as bad as the ground, but it's not a bench. I'll give you another mashal. I once saw this. Someone did Hagbah, and he lost his balance, and Sefer Torah fell onto the bima. There's no chiyuv tainis, it didn't hit the ground. So hitting the bima, hitting the bench is potter. But if they hit the platform that people walk there, even though it's now walked on so commonly, but it's still ground. So that's why it seems platform, and certainly the steps, would not be a ptur. Different question is, Lamaisa, only part of the Sefer Torah fell on the ground. I'll give you a very common example. During Hagva, someone lost balance on one hand, the weaker hand obviously, and one half of the Sefer Torah, one of the Atzchaim hit the ground, but the other one he's still clutching on very carefully. Does he have to fast or not? So you start thinking about Hilchas Shabbos. We know the Gemara speaks about you're holding on to a Sefer and part of it rolled out of the Rishus, so it's considered Haitzah. Do we compare it to that? Pashtus, you don't have to come on to Rayas. Isn't it a Bezayin seeing a Sefer Torah even partially on the floor? Now, the fact that you're holding on to one half doesn't take away from the Bezayin. And I would add more so. The Paiskim say if someone Chalila dropped the tefillin onto the floor, but he's still holding on to the Ritzuis, it doesn't help. He has to fast, because the Batim are touching the ground. So what do I care if part of Sefer Torah is off the ground, part is on the ground? And you want to be technical, you could even add that even part of the Sefer Torah has so much Torah. Part of the Sefer Torah has more Torah than tefillin. It only has the Parshiyos. Still you have to fast by tefillin. So again, I don't think it's a perfect raya, but I saw a long list of paiskim. The Imrei Eish we mentioned, the Marshag, Beis Yitzchak, Abnei Tzedek, Siman Kuf Yud Zayin, the Shag HaMer, Tzitzel Yez, I saw the Makar Chaim and Shulchan Aruch Kuf Mem Gimel all say, even if part of the Sefer Torah, one half hit the ground, one has to fast. Now I did mention all those paiskim because I did see the Chazayin Ish in Maaseh Ish, Beis Kuf Beis, and Alicha Shleim, Betfilah Yutes, Lamates, Hara 117, that seems to hold, if part of the Sefer Torah is still being held, you don't have to fast. But it's a big chiddush, like Zechisi Lahavin, and as we said, most paiskim feel even part of the Sefer Torah is enough of a bezayin that requires tainus. Rav Shlomo Klug in the Avach HaShleima, in Archaim Siman Shin Samach Aleph, he has a lamdish approach that when Ba'ogdei Biyodoi Loinechshav Agabi Karka, it's not considered hanacha. When part of it's in your hand, it's not considered hanacha. So maybe in this context, it's a svara to mekel, but he then says at the end, Lamaisa, you should fast. Rav Moshe, in Chayla Gimel, the end of Siman Gimel, he says, Lamaisa, it makes sense, you should fast. Someone wants to be mekel, ein maznichanai, so you can't criticize him. So I think we could say, most places you're mechuyev to fast, Rav Moshe recommends it, that's the right course of action. Whether it's during Hag B'Galila, or as I mentioned, the shah that I began with, the Sefer Torah rolled off the bima, part of it's on the floor, part of it's on the bima, they should be geyser tainis on all those that were there. If someone wants to be a little more makel on people, no, we have a svara to be makel, b'chlal on others, and in this case, some are makel when it's on, part of it's on being held, but halacha, most paiskim are machmir. The Mechas Alaza in Chayla Gimel, Siman Nun Beis of the Shaila, where a person was sitting holding the Sefer Torah after Hagbah, and he lost his grip, the Sefer Torah fell backwards. So he's still holding it, but the top of the Sefer Torah is now touching the ground. And he proves, quoting his father also, that's considered touching the ground. He compares it to Hilchas Shabbos. So the Maisa, in that case, one has to fast. What is a question that comes up, a person did Hagba and the Atichayim cracked. So he lost the grip on one half of the Sefer Torah, which promptly fell on the floor. The other side, he was still holding on to it. So this is Mamash Our Shaila. Even though he's being held, but parts are on the ground. Plus, this is a very scary message. This is Mamash the Ramban, that Torah fell on the floor b'shas Hagba. And the Tzibah saw it, and boy, do they make a gasp when they see such a thing. And it's important that here, the Ayam should fast, even though only part fell on the ground. I must mention, a Gabbai should be careful to only give Hagba to someone who's qualified. First, he has to have the manpower. Also, you have to learn Hilchos Hagba. You're not supposed to open the Sefer Torah more than 2 or 3 columns. People like to open it wide. That's looking for trouble. It's not right. Shulchan Aruch says not to open it too much. Get a grip. Also, you don't just lift the Sefer Torah up. That shows you're very strong, but that's not right because it might crack. You're supposed to get leverage, bend it over, and then you could pick it up and it doesn't risk cracking it. If you pick it up suddenly, you're giving it the weight that might crack the Atichayim. So I don't think there's a licensed Hagba person. But Rav Zalman said the Gabbai should only give those that know how to do it properly. During Akafis it happens, the Sefer Torah falls, and as we said, the fact that it's on Yom Tov is not a p'tur. The fact you're trying to do a mitzvah is not a p'tur, because we said even during Hagba, if it falls, one has to fast. So, especially, sometimes, unfortunately, during a kafas, it's a pshia. People are not careful, and I don't have to mention, even if someone drinks, chalili, he should hold the Sefer Torah in his hand, whether it's night or day. That's certainly reckless, but Sefer Torah on Simchas Torah has to be held very carefully, and any question, don't hold the Sefer Torah. It's a very scary message when Sefer Torah falls during Simchas Torah. We're trying to show covered, and look what happened. And indeed, the Marish Taif in Siman Reish Hey, the Shaga Meir that I mentioned, the Minchas Yitzchak and the Tshuva all said, during Hakafais, even though you're doing a mitzvah, fasting should be required. I did see, Rav Shlomo Zalman, Alicha Shleim, Pesach, Amid Tav Vav, that he was asked a shayla about Hakafas, the Sefer Torah fell. He didn't want to answer the shayla. I don't know what his suffix was, but the Paiskim don't seem to make any chilik Hakafas or any time of the year. An interesting question, if a Sefer Torah apostle Sefer Torah fell on the ground. Typically, on Simchas Torah, they use even apostle Sefer Torah. Is that any chilik regarding the Chiyuv of Tainus? So the emes is, it's not as bad as a Kashra Sefer Torah, but it's bad enough. Don't forget, it has Shemus Hashem. You're not to erase Shemus Hashem from apostle Sefer Torah. And even if it's mamish beyond repair, this whole halacha is how to bury it. You can't just put it in the Shemus. And the fact is that most of the Sefer Torah is kosher. And I saw a host of Paiskim, the Marash Engel and Chelik Vav, Siman Yotzit Kat and Gimel, the Chaim Sha'ol that we mentioned, the Chasalaz that we mentioned, the Hari Bashemayim, the Marshag, were all talking about apostle Sefer Torah, and still they did not consider that any svara to be mekel. In other words, it's not as bad as a kosher, but it's bad enough. Fascinating question. Someone was carrying a Sefer Torah in the street. He was transporting it, and he dropped it in the street. Who has to fast? The entire borough park or Flatbush, the entire Avenue J? How does it work? Streets, districts, borough. So I think it's totally in the reasons. If the reason is it's a wake-up call to the community, I don't know, is there a community on the street? If it's a wake-up call to the one that sent him, so if he's carrying Sefer Torah for the shul, it's a wake-up call for the shul. If it's stam the bezayin of Torah, then those that saw it. So it makes sense that those that saw it definitely have to fast, but it's hard to make a mechachiv on the entire district, the entire borough park or Flatbush. Those that saw it would have to fast. Then I found the Chashuk Yechemed of Zilberstein and Bavakama Omid Reish Hey that takes this similar approach. It depends what the reason is to apply it lemaisa. The Avnei Tzedek, Yerdei Kuv Yudzayin, that was the Zayda of the Satmarov, had an interesting shaila. There was sort of a break-off minyan. People left a certain shul, made their own minyan. The first day they davened in their own shul, children went to the old shul that they abandoned, took out the Sefer Torah, and started playing with it, and one part of the Sefer Torah hit the ground. So he says, "Oi, do you hear the wake-up call, the message in this story? The first time you daven and you abandoned that shul because of the politics, look what happened." So he says, this is a clear-cut chi of tainis, and the first thing he says is, do tshuva. Before everything, you have to have charat al what you did, because that caused this tragedy. You have to have a gadol to see that it's not just happened, there is a wake-up call, there's a reason. Rav Zilberstein in a different place had a shaila where someone stole the Sefer Torah, and he was driving with his bike, and someone yelled, I guess, "Chapsum!" And the guy got so scared that he dropped it. So the question is not if the guy has to fast, but the yid that screamed, does he have to fast? So he says no. He did it to save a Sefer Torah, not to mevaz it. So he's mekel. I must mention, I did see the Tshuva Tzvi Teferes, the Beis Baruch and Yudal Reish Lamed quotes this. There was once a fire in a shul, and someone ran in, and he was not careful at all. He was like a little reckless. He grabbed the Sefer Torah that were not in imminent danger and dropped it. So the Tzvi Teferes says he has to fast. Now, what's the chiluk? Chiluk is pashut. Here, the person dropped the Sefer Torah, although he meant well, but he dropped the Sefer Torah. But in the previous case, the guy dropped the Sefer Torah. So it's obviously two different cases. A very painful shaila that sometimes can happen when a person does hagbin properly, when the klaf tore. Again, if you don't do a hagba properly, you do it too suddenly or too wide, the klaf tears. That's a much more serious shaila. Says the Marsham and Beis Reish Samach Dalid that's much worse, because tearing a Sefer Torah is like burning a Sefer Torah. And we should never know it, but when a Sefer Torah is burnt, it's a shrekel chamaisa. Many gedolim will make a levaya for it, and they'll mamish have a tainis with anenu, like mamish, like a terrible tragedy, which it really is. The Divrei Chaim has a seder, what to do. There's the Zichron Yehuda, Mem Dalid, Shever Levi, Chelik Yud, Simon Yud Beis. Some people make a very big levaya, especially if there was vandalism, foul play. But basically, tearing Sefer Torah is like burning. We were talking about a falling Sefer Torah. An interesting question, when the Sefer Torah fell in a yeshiva, and if there would be guys in the whole yeshiva, it would cause a mass bittul Torah, because if there's a tainis, so there's no second seder, and once there's no second seder, so night seder is in jeopardy. So Pashut will say, listen, Yidden are soldiers. You tell me to learn, I learn. Tell me to fast, I fast. No one says I'm potter from tainis because I want to learn. So why should that be a ptur in the tainis? But the obvious chiluk is, on a tainis chiyuvi, there's no excuse. But the whole thing is only a call to tshuva. So a tainis that will cause bittul Torah is hardly a call to tshuva. So lamaisa, some say the bachrim could instead make a tainis dibur the whole day. I think bachrim would rather fast than make a tainis dibur. But then I saw something amazing. Besides Rabbi Yashiv in the Ashrei Ish Yeridei Simon Samach, Sif Kat Nalef, that says if it's bittul Torah you don't have to fast, I saw in the Tuvchay Abiyu Chelik Beis Amid Reish Shin Chav Gimel the following Ma'aseh Shehaya. It happened in the winter of Tav Shin Samach in Lakewood, Ir HaTorah. It seems by davening on Shabbos, someone dropped the Sefer Torah, fell onto the floor, mamish, and there were hundreds of Bnei Torah there, and there are hundreds more learning. So they asked Rabbi Yashiv, do all have to fast? What's halacha with women? And what's going to be if it's bittul Torah for the entire yeshiva? They're all fasting. So his response was that really there's what to be makel, only the one that caused an afila. But he said, since Rav Moshe is the Mora, the Aser of America, the Paisik of America, and he writes in his true that we mentioned earlier, the entire tzibah has to fast, so the entire tzibah has to fast. The second question, women do not have to fast, which is very similar to the Divrei Chaim. But the third question, he says, if there's bittul Torah, then they shouldn't fast. And the svara, I guess, is obvious. It's all to improve our ways, not to cause a massive bittul Torah. And last but not least, just to talk a little bit about the program when it does happen and there is a chi of tainis. So we said earlier that lamaisa, the tzibah has to fast. When to fast is a good question. The Mari Brunner said a big chiddush. If it fell this morning and you didn't have a coffee before breakfast, still fasting, fast that very day. There's no Kabbalah's tainis, But Boi B'yoim is more important than Kabbalas Tainus. So you see, ideally, you're supposed to fast that day. Although there's a Hagah, a note on the Mari Brunner that says that, no, don't fast today because you're on Makabal Tainus. Without Makabal Tainus, a Tainus Yachid is garnished. So he says, wait till tomorrow, be Makabal by Mincha today. But I saw a list of Paiskim, the Knesset Gedoyla, in Sivka and Zayin, El Yerabah, Ber Hativ, Chesed Alofim, Ben Ishchai, Kafachaim, all say the emes is like the Mari Brunner. It's more important to fast by B'yoim. And I guess the svara is, a tragedy happened, don't delay your response to tomorrow. So if you could do it today, do it today. If the person had already ate or drank that day, so you can't fast today, so then the procedure is to fast tomorrow. But before you fast tomorrow, says the Minchas Yitzchak Lekutim and Simon Gimel, the Mishtayf from Yeshama Chesed is also, then you should be Makabal Tainus. If you could be Makabal, it's better to be Makabal. I saw a fascinating shayla, which you think is not as, you don't realize how serious it is. Someone dropped the Sefer Torah on Shavasa B'Tamuz. He didn't eat yet. Could he be yait to the Tainus with that? So what's very similar to this is a person had a bad dream on Shabbos, and he fasted Tainus Chaloim. You're not supposed to, but he did. So you have to make a Tainus on Sunday. Sunday is a Tainus Shavasa B'Tamuz. So this is in the early Achrayim, the Masas Ben Yamin, and other Achrayim, Mr. Bur and Reish Pei Ches, Yivkot and Ches, quotes this, that it's possible that you could be Yoitze the fast on Sunday, both for Shavasa B'Tamuz, and the Chiyuv of fasting because you fasted on Shabbos. But others argue, you see, no, Sunday is Shavasa B'Tamuz. How are you Yoitze the Chiyuv fasting because you dropped the Sefer, because you fasted on Shabbos? I saw a beautiful tshuva in Madana Yom Tov Chelik Aleph Simon Gimel. He says, but in our case, you could be mekel. Why? Because in our case, there's a chiyuv by b'yoyim. So if today's a fast, maybe today is better. And also, our case is not a chiyuv within a Gemara to fast. The case of fasting after Shabbos Tainus, to make it up on Sunday, that's a din Gemara. And certainly, last but not least, the actual objective of all of this is to ma'ir the olam, to get the message, receive the message, to do tshuva, and that's why there are many different paiskim that suggest various forms of responses. Some shuls they had a tainus tzibur mamish with mincha leini vayechal, with anenu, with avinu malkeinu. You look in the earlier paiskim. Some made a tainus. They didn't lein by mincha, but they did say anenu by mincha. The ik is to receive the message. The Tufcha Yabiu Chelik Beis quotes a story that once asked the Marash Engel a certain shayla, if you have to fast, in this case, he said no. And then something else happened. So they went back and he says, maybe your first psak was wrong. Because look, something else happened. Maybe you were wrong. We should have fasted. So he says, no, I wasn't wrong. You were wrong. My psak was right. Your response was wrong. You didn't do anything about it. I told you not to fast, but you have to do something. And they didn't do anything about it. In other words, the ikka is like the Rambam says regarding a tainus, even a tainus siba, which the word brings in the beginning of Hilchos Tainus. The ikka of a tainus is not the tainus, it's the response of tshuva. If you just fast without doing tshuva, you're doing the tafel and leaving the ikka. And let us be Messiah B'Davatoi. It's a well-known, one of the Kehillos, Portland, Oregon, for many, many years. It was a religious community without a Rav. One Yom Kippur, one of the three people holding the Sefer Torah by Kol Nidre collapsed and Sefer Torah fell on the floor. And people were shocked. And one Yid said, listen, if the Sefer Torah falls on the floor, it's because we're not supporting Torah enough. We must get a Rav. And the rest, like they say, is history. That they got a Rav that built the Kehillah and brought out the best of the Kehillah. That's the right approach. But we don't have to wait, Khalil, till something like this happens. By Mechazik Torah, we won't have these problems. Let's just chaz, we learned Bekitza. The sugya is a fascinating sugya, as you saw. It's not in Gemara, Rishonim, or Shulchan Aruch, but it's very well documented. We had 6 or 7 reasons. It's true. The main reason of Megiddah Shahar status, we can't let this go by without a important response. Zil basa time, even if Sefer Torah falls with the mantle, you have to fast. Even an oynis, who fasts? Those that were involved, certainly, and ideally all those that were there. Members, you could be makel, but those that were there certainly should fast. Even concurrent minyanim should partake. Members should do something, if they don't have to fast, but something at least. A zaken, a chayla, women, a ketana mapota. Even if it falls on Shabbos or Yom Tov, zil basa taima. A person fell with the Sefer Torah, but the Sefer Torah did not touch the ground, no fast. If even part of the Sefer Torah fell on the ground or touched the ground, one has to fast. A person and the Sefer Torah laying on the floor, who do you pick up first? Probably the Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah fell in the Aron HaKodesh, no Chiyuv Tainis. The Aron HaKodesh was open and it fell onto the ground. Avada is a Chiyuv. Aron HaKodesh fell down with the Sefer Torah in it. There's no Chiyuv Tainis. Steps or platform, there is a Chiyuv Tainis. Bench or table or bima, it fell onto that. There's no Chiyuv Tainis. Part of it fell on the ground, rolled on the ground. You have to fast. That's a chayim cracked or turned backwards. You have to fast. Give Hagba only to those that are qualified, and do the Hagba properly. A Sefer Torah puzzle, there is a Chiyuv Tainis in the street. Those that saw it certainly should fast. If it was torn or burned, chas v'shalom, that's a much more serious response is needed. If there's massive bittul Torah, you can be makel. Only those that were involved should fast, not those that were present. That ideally it should be done by b'yom, even without a Kabbalah. If it's not shaykh by b'yom, be makabel for the next day. Rather, some say you could wait till Monday or Thursday. You could push it off a day or two. But basically, the ikka is not the tainis. The ikka is the response. The ikka is to see the importance of Torah and get the message. A guten Tag to you all.